I'm Professor Symour Mauskopf, Professor Emeritus at Duke University, and it's a pleasure to be teaching at VIU. The second course I'm teaching this semester here is a course called Science and the Modern Literary Imagination. One often thinks of a disjunction between scientists and literary people or humanists, as exemplified by C.P. Snow's notion of the two cultures, the scientific culture and the humanistic culture. In fact, writers have always responded to science, and one of the interesting themes to explore in a course is this response. Particularly writers who exercise their imagination to deal with the social implications of science and science-based technology. In this course, I have a rather broad definition of what I mean by science and technology, because I begin with Christopher Marlowe's The Tragical History of Dr. Faustus, a play first produced in 1592 and dealing with essentially demonic magic. Dr. Faustus appeals to the devil to get power over the world, and he does so, but pays the price at the end of his life and the end of the play by going to hell for eternity. This theme, however, fits into 16th century views, broader views of what science and technology were, because many of the leading figures in that period were, in fact, interested in enterprises like alchemy, natural magic, and the religious themes of the time were, of course, very important. I move on to a series of works of the 19th and 20th century, which deal with various aspects of, you might say, the boundaries of where science should go, or boundaries, perhaps, where science shouldn't go. The first of these works is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. First produced in 1816, which deals with Victor Frankenstein producing from body parts of corpses a fiend or monster, but a highly intelligent fiend or monster, and indeed a very sensitive fiend and monster. I then go on to look at a series of works of the late 19th and early 20th century that look to the future and express a new type of, you might say, vision of science and technology, namely what kind of world and what kind of society will be produced by the impact of science and technology. The first of these is H.G. Wells' The Time Machine. The second is E.M. Forster's The Machine Stops, which deals with an astonishing world, an amazingly prescient work of over 100 years ago, dealing with essentially the world of electronic communication, which is just coming into being now. The third is Aldous Huxley's Brave New Worlds, which deals with the, shall we say, biological manipulation of human populations to produce a dystopia equivalent to Plato's Republic, where you have different peoples of different abilities performing different functions in societies. So all of these works deal with, essentially, meditations on what science and technology might produce in future societies, how they might influence, indeed transform societies. The second half of the course deals with more recent works. For example, the film Destination Moon of 1950, which is one of the earliest films to actually prefigure in great detail what a trip to the moon, as occurred about 20 years later, would actually be like. And then I go into a number of other works of the late 20th century, some of which deal with issues of the impact of information technology, electronic technology, and of biotechnology, the artificial formation, for example, of gene sequences. I've been talking mainly about science fiction, that is the extrapolation of future societies on the basis of science and technology. I also use two plays that deal of the 20th century that deal with the issue of science and religion. One is Bertolt Brecht's Galileo, and the other is the play Inherit the Wind, which deals with the Scopes trial in Tennessee in 1925 over the teaching of Darwinian evolutionary theory. This latter play, I might say, is all too topical today, where there is still controversy and attempts to constrain the teaching of Darwinian evolution. The last thing I would say is my own insights from the history of science. For each of these plays, or at least groups of these plays, I provide context in terms of developments in science, technology, and society that were taking place when these works or plays, these literary creations were being produced. For example, I have a lecture in which I talk about the 16th century as the enchanted century, in terms of the occult sciences such as alchemy, magic. For Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, I have a lecture on romantic science in the early 19th century. For Wells, E.M. Forster, and Aldous Huxley, I talk about the momentous developments of science and technology in the late 19th and early 20th century. And finally, for the works dealing with space travel, Destination Moon, I talk about the context of the development of space travel in the 1950s and 60s in connection with the Cold War and with the new technological possibilities of space travel. Lastly, I might mention that one of the things I do is show a considerable number of films. And I invite the students to do comparisons and contrasts between, first of all, the different literary styles of the written work versus the cinematic production of the work, and also the different cultural styles. For example, the film of Frankenstein of 1931 is very different from Mary Shelley's original novel. What does the difference have to do with a century later and an American rather than a British context for this? And similarly with the films of other works, for example, Wells' The Time Machine of 1895, the film The Time Machine of 1960.